Alright, we are back in the shop. Today we are going to be working on this circuit board. Really not much to do here other than swap out the LED. It's kind of a sensitive procedure. It's soldering, so you got to keep that in mind. If you're not comfortable with soldering, maybe it's not something you want to tackle, or maybe it's something you want to get some help with. If you have someone around who's, you know, pretty adept at that. So, you know, the tools you're going to need for this one are obviously a soldering iron. That's kind of number one. You might need some flux. I doubt that, though. It's just makes soldering easier for putting the new one on. It's not really 100% necessary, but it is, you know, kind of nice to have it available to you if you got it around. So we'll get the soldering iron here. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on and get that up to temp. You're definitely going to need some tweezers. So there's my tweezers. And then, you know, whatever LEDs you're going to need. So there's, and this is obviously my helping hands. Super helpful. We talked about it in the last episode. You can get these off of Amazon for a few dollars, or at Harbor Freight for a few dollars. Let me go ahead and tighten this one up. Now, as far as LEDs go, you can use two real different types. There's 0603 and 0805 LEDs. Unfortunately, you'll probably get them in a big bulk because that's how they come. But, you know, maybe that just gives you room to mod some for your friends and show them cool stuff like controller modding and things like that. So, this person wants a yellow one. So, I have a box full of these dudes, and they come in these little strips here. You can kind of see what they look like. I believe this is actually yellow, so that's what we need. I keep a bunch of different ones here. I've got like yellow, pink, green, blue, red. I think the red and the blue look awesome. The yellow is pretty cool too. Orange is another popular one. But, you know, that's all we need to kind of get started for what this user wants. So we'll set that to the side. I'm going to try to set the camera here, or maybe I'll set the project where the camera is already pointing, centered. This is going to be, for the most part, somewhat delicate stuff. And there's some stuff you got to understand about these LEDs. I'm going to go ahead and pull in another tool here we haven't really shown before. It's called a multimeter or multimeter, depending on how you say it. It's just a way to measure current and voltage. In the case of an LED, mine has a setting that lets me test diodes, which is this black setting here with that error. So you can figure out which side is the positive or negative, or, you know, whatever. The thing about LEDs is they are diodes, so electricity can only flow one way. So the way this board is set up is, this is as if we were holding it here. This is up, right, down, left. This side is the black side, and this side is the red. So if I have my multimeter set to test that, you can barely see that in the video, but that LED is turning on. So we need to make sure we orient this so that whenever we get the new one in there, the LED still turns on. If you don't have a multimeter, the backs of these, this is going to be way too tiny to show on camera, but the backs of these here, let's see if we can get this to focus. It's not going to happen. All right. One side of these usually has a little marking on it. The marking side is the negative side. So one side will be clear and one side will have a little green dot or an arrow or something, and that goes on this side. But we need to get this old one out first. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my stool, since I like to solder with the stool, and we'll get going. So I'm going to do this with a soldering iron rather than with hot air, because It's probably the way that most people will be doing it. I do usually prefer to do this with hot air just because I find it easier. We also have something at work called hot tweezers, where you can actually just, it's a soldering iron built into tweezers, and you can just pinch things off. It's really nice. So really this is just about heating one side up and kind of picking the component up a little bit. When you're doing this, you might want to actually just spin the whole project around so you can keep the soldering iron in the hand that you're most comfortable with, one way or the other. I can solder with either, so it doesn't really bother me too much, but I usually do that as well, but I'm also trying to keep things in frame for the camera here. So it's as simple as that. I got the component off. I typically just throw these away because I don't ever reuse the white ones. The ones that come from the factory are the 0805 size. I happen to have tons of these tiny 0603 LEDs left from working on 360s, because these had 4 of them. They formed the little ring of light around the ground button. So I'm going to go ahead and actually set this down on my work surface here, leave that there. What I like to do, let's see if I can get this in the frame. What I like to do is actually test these before I put them on, because I've actually had one that was bad before. So you should be able to see that in the video. That lights up a nice yellow, like amber color. So this is good. I like to clean up this mess here a little bit first. It doesn't come off quite cleanly. You can do this 2 ways. You can take a soldering iron and just kind of try to wick it flat. That's one way to do it if you don't have solder wick. Another way that you can do it is with solder wick, which just cleans up some of the excess solder, puts it nice and flat there. And I like to hit this with just a tiny bit only on one side, because I like to tack it down on one side first. Tiny bit of fresh solder so that it's a shiny ball. So this is why you need the tweezers. And alright. Alright. So your first attempt at getting it in there probably won't work out right. Yeah, so I had it in there and I just touched it again. These are just finicky, and I mean, they're not really meant to be soldered by hand, and they're not terribly difficult either, but at least for me, it is one of the more sensitive parts of the whole operation, unfortunately, and you just got to be careful doing it. Alright, so that's perfect. It's perfectly centered. It's flat on there. It's another reason why the hot air works really well, because it just kind of melds in place. And so now we're set to do this side. So you just hit the pad for a second or two, add a tiny bit more solder, and you're good to go. A word of caution, if you keep too much heat on an LED for too long of a period of time, you'll burn it out, and that's all she wrote. You'll have to replace it. So again, let's take our multimeter, black in this hand, red in this hand. Let's just touch the sides of this. If it lights up when you're touching the solder, chances are you're good to go, and in this case we are. So and then obviously to put this back together in this other shell, we just kind of do the reverse of what we did before. So this piece comes out. I'm going to go ahead and zoom this out. So to get us back in this shell, we take the circuit board we just modified, and these side with these bumper clicks actually go like this, so that these battery prongs are facing up towards you, and it just would pop back into place. Now, before you do that, you actually do have to remember that there's buttons that go under there. So let's get all these parts out that we need. The A, B, the X, and the Y. And this is if you were changing these out for like some solid colored ones, if you were doing like a blackout controller, or just trying to make them match a shell, this is when you do that. But you want to make sure you have the A, B, X, Y, the menu, the select, or you know, the start and select buttons, whatever they actually call them, the guide button, and this sync button here. So these buttons here are keyed. They can only go in one way, so there's really no way to screw them up. They just kind of lock into place. You should probably, if you play a lot of Xbox, you would know which ones they are anyway. And this is the way that the PlayStation ones are too. This is pretty universal across the board. Okay, so those are in. Same deal here. These are keyed so that they can go into the right spot. If you happen to have those tweezers, they can help with this this stage. And the guide button. The guide button is clear, and that's how that LED light shines through it, basically. This sync button, we're going to wait a second to do that until we've got this circuit board in this, the circuit board in, and then we'll do this part next. So this is just the reverse of how we put it in before. We just pop it in. I'm sorry. Totally missed a step. You got to put this gasket with the domes back on first, and it just slides in like that. Then you put this in. Getting all flustered. All right. So you need those smaller Torx 5 screws that you, or yeah, Torx 6 screws that you took out before. I like to start with the middle one. It just gets things in a nice place. And that kind of puts things down. And then I do one more, and then we'll do a sanity check here after we put this one in next to the B button under the trigger. This is not set in stone, and you don't have to do it the way that I'm doing it here, but basically the reason I do this is when you put those buttons in, there is a chance that they will either A, need to be fiddled with. The little legs that make them lock into place are just too big. Maybe they were made in China, and they were just too big, and you have to take something like a small hand file and just kind of work them so that they fit in there, the thickness or the width, and get them to fit in there. Or what they can do is maybe you didn't have a button settled incorrectly, and now it's like crooked. The B one doesn't count because it's not actually under that board. But if you didn't have a button in there correctly, these would feel weird, basically. This here is called Captain tape, K-A-P-T-O-N, not like Captain Chunk or anything like that. That's for the IR sensors that are here and here, mostly, to help keep things aligned. On newer controllers, these actually aren't there anymore. It's just a piece of plastic that's molded into this. So before I said we were going to wait to do this sync button. So now that you have this up, and I know that all these buttons have the right feel to them, nothing is out of skew, there's a tiny, tiny little slot right here. And before you can put this back on, you have to put the piece for the wireless sync in there. And if you'll notice, there's actually a small tactile switch there, and you should be able to hear it click, and that's for like wireless syncing. This step actually here requires a little bit of finesse. If you're finding yourself having trouble with it, you might need to take the bumpers off, put this on, and then put the bumpers on. Just take your time and you'll get it. So what I like to do here is I like to hold the board this way, and there's these two tabs here, and I like to try to line them up over that USB port where that lines up there, get them behind the edges of these rumbles here, and hold down the guide button on the other side, and it just snaps into place. That took me a lot of practice. That could be a very frustrating step for you the first time you do it. Just don't give up, and don't push anything too hard if it feels like it's going to break. So that kind of sums up this area here of the controller. I'm just going to put these screws back in. That's essentially where you would do changing buttons, changing triggers, changing bumpers, changing the D-pad, and obviously I showed how to do the LED. That part's kind of tricky. I would, maybe practice on some stuff first. I learned to solder by buying a bunch of junk electronics or taking apart kids' toys that were broken, and just learning how to solder things off and put them back on, and kind of see how they tick. I am not an electronics expert by any mean, but if you're looking to get more into it, there's a good book called Electronics for Inventors that I found very helpful. So that kind of concludes this step here. Everything is good. Everything functions the way it should. So the next thing we'll do is I'll actually show you how I mark this case to be drilled for underside buttons, my philosophy on where I put them and where you can put them to fit kind of your hand and your play style there. And then we'll just kind of seal the whole thing back up, and we're done for the basic mod set. I can show you a couple ways to do trigger stops. The person who wants this controller does not want trigger stops. I'll bring one of my custom ones down that I use for myself and show a couple different ways we could do that there. So thanks for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way.